All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Just a quick note, everybody comes in on mute. And so we're actually probably going to leave folks on the mute for a little bit, other than Alex and myself, just until we sort of make sure that folks are not Zoom bombing us and doing bad things. But my name is Eileen Corcoran. I'm with the Vermont Historical Society, and I'm happy to see some familiar faces already and or familiar names. So welcome to our roundtable. We'll take another minute or so just to see if anybody else hops on. Obviously, if you're new to Zoom, we do have a chat going on. And so that's certainly anything if you want to introduce yourselves or ask a question. If you don't want to do it on audio, feel free to put that down there. And then again, I will sort of generally ask when we unmute people, you're welcome, and it's probably encouraged if you don't plan on talking to mute yourself, just to sort of try and eliminate too much background noise when folks are talking. Pardon my hands, because my webcam is right there. It's very annoying.
Amanda, I think you have to like go to your profile on the Zoom website and change it there before you can have it change in the program. At least that's my experience on the Mac. Oh, Laura has a better plan. Thanks, Laura.
Oh, fun. See, things to know. We're all.
Oh yeah, she's right. If you click, if you're in the gallery view and you see yourself in the top right corner, there may be 3 dots in your picture box, and there should be a rename option. That's much simpler than my suggestion.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just unmute everybody, and that does give you control over your own muting and unmuting at this point in time. So again, if you don't want to be talking, feel free to mute your microphone again. We like learning, Amanda, right? So again, I think most everybody heard this, but there are 1 or 2 of you coming on. My name is Eileen Corcoran. I'm with the Vermont Historical Society, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. This is our first virtual round table. So the idea and the hope is we just have a chance to see and hear from each other in the online world and talk through a few things, some related to what's going on now, some just related to Museum and Historical Society stuff. So again, quick points. Now everybody is technically unmuted on my end. Feel free to mute your microphone if you're not planning on talking, just so we avoid background noise. We will say that obviously some meetings have been issues related to Zoom bombing. We're trying to keep this open, but if for some reason we do get somebody that joins nefariously, we're just sort of asking people to not necessarily react to them and hope that we will all see that. And as a host, I'll be able to block them and get them out as soon as possible. Technically only the host can screen share, so hopefully that should keep down that, but we're hoping that everybody looks like wonderful people so far, so we're not going to worry. So I would like to welcome and thank Alex from the Saint Albans Museum for joining us today, sort of our co-host. And we wanted to talk about virtual volunteering. So the idea that we obviously can't see each other now, and how are we sort of interacting and using our volunteers and board members. So Alex, I don't know if you sort of wanted to start off with anything about the Saint Albans Museum and volunteers and sort of what you usually do with them, I guess.
Sure. So if you're not familiar with SAM, which is what our short name for the Saint Albans Museum, it started out as the Saint Albans Historical Society in 1966. The first meeting was February that year, and folks met in members' homes to share information and you know, slides and photographs and to have lectures and discussions. The museum itself opened in 1971. So we're located in the former Church Street Academy, which operated as a school from 1861 until 1969. It's 3 stories. So we're sort of a small historical society, historic site, right in the heart of the village green in Saint Albans. We're open seasonally because not all of the building is climate controlled. So the exhibits are open June through October for tours, but we do programming year-round and field trips from April through October. We have about 25 volunteers approximately who serve a variety of functions. The biggest group is probably docents. So those are folks who act as our guides. They volunteer on a weekly basis to show visitors around the museum and staff the front desk and things like that. Our next largest group is our collections committee. So these are folks who work in our research room, which is our archives area. They help with exhibit design and installation and those sorts of research and collections related tasks. We have folks who help out with educational programming, special events. We have a dedicated team of 3 gentlemen that work around the building, helping with maintenance and hands-on projects. We have folks who do administrative support and help out with like mailings and special events and things like that. And then of course our board is comprised of about 15 volunteers, and I'm the only staff member who's full-time. We do have an intern with us this spring, Lisa Evans, who's fantastic. And so volunteers have really been at the heart of the Saint Albans Museum since we opened, and certainly were the driving force behind our work in a lot of ways through the years, including until now.
And sort of, Alex, is there anything sort of you've done right off the bat as far as now, again, obviously you closed the museum, and then how do you sort of talk with your volunteers, but also interact or engage with them? Do you have specific tasks that you've sort of given them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We were really fortunate to have such a talented and broad base of volunteers. We have high school students that are, you know, earning community service hours. We have college students that are completing internships for academic credit. They're interested in the museum field. We have folks that are working or retired who just love their community or love history. So the first step for us was really trying to find a way to, like, how could we define this new normal? You know, we recognized this wasn't going to be simply about, you know, okay, the museum's closed, the doors are shut, and we'll see you when this is all over. You know, that wouldn't work for us. Volunteers were important to kind of continuing to engage in our mission and our work, you know, even if the facility itself wasn't going to be open. So part of that was, you know, really being transparent and honest in our communications with our volunteers. You know, they received the same message and the same information that our board was getting, you know, and most things, and, you know, inviting them to be a part of the discussion and to really reach out and say, like, we need you. You know, we need your support, we need your expertise, we still need your time and talents, even if we're not together in a shared workspace. You know, there's a lot to be done, and there's ways that we can still serve our community through education and other sort of forward-facing programming. Part of it, this early engagement also revolved around being really empathetic and patient. You know, there's a great article kind of circulating on the internet from Harvard Business Review about, you know, that discomfort we're all feeling right now is grief, and recognizing, you know, that, you know, we were colleagues and friends. We were the kind of volunteer group that would, didn't have to work too hard to find an excuse to celebrate something with cake. So, you know, just recognizing that that social time and that connection and community was going to be missing. We really wanted to find a way to kind of be really patient and empathetic and try to find a way to reconnect in that way. Part of it was socially, right? So making sure that we were still emailing each other and kind of saying, hey, just as people and friends outside of the work. We created a Facebook group where people can kind of just check in every day and post things and sort of stay connected virtually. And then the second phase of that was to really find a way to demonstrate that the work continued. So we sort of, as soon as we could, we did a lot of one-on-ones in terms of technical support to get folks on Zoom, you know, the platform we're using now, and to figure out how we could continue to maintain a schedule of meetings and to continue to push the work forward. I think it was important to recognize that, you know, you had to keep planning for the future. It's easy, I think, during this pandemic to feel really, and we need to be, right? You need to be sensitive and aware and informed so that you can be safe, but it's also easy to sort of be stuck in this loop of being only in the present, right? And only just kind of reacting to this changing landscape day to day. So it's important to acknowledge that, and it's just as important to keep planning for the future, that there will be a time when we're outside of this space. No doubt our social landscape will be transformed, but you know, there's still work we can do with exhibits. So obviously we were working on a big project, a room renovation for our railroad exhibit right before this all started happening. So even though we're not physically in the space making changes to display cases or painting or things like that, how can we continue to utilize online tools to select images, to continue doing research, to continue writing labels and captions and narratives? One of the things we launched that really required volunteer support as soon as we realized that schools were going to be switching to remote instruction was finding a way to utilize part of our collections. How can we put images, objects online? How can we take our educational resources that we use for field trips and make them available for free to the public so that students have opportunities to learning from home? We participated with the Vermont Curators Group in a virtual tour exhibition so that folks can literally stand in the museum from their computer screen and look around. And all those things required volunteer support and volunteer assistance. And the other piece was keeping folks informed with ways that they could stay engaged outside of just the museum. So certainly there's a lot of work to be done within our own organization, but there are a lot of great public history opportunities that are out there. The National Archives has their Citizen Archives program. The Library of Congress has We the People. Smithsonian has digital volunteers. These are opportunities for folks to do things like transcription, where they can look through old documents and transcribe them and be a part of kind of bringing history to life, you know, from their living room, from their kitchen table, that don't require you to be in a physical space. So, you know, kind of sharing the larger world of engaging with public history and museum content outside of our own organization was also a part of that. But just to sort of reemphasize, it was that sort of transparent, open, and regular communication, and finding ways to continue to do the work and to be engaged and involved and you know, connected to each other in a way that still felt meaningful. Because you know, that's the reason we volunteer, right? We're mission-driven folks. We're passionate about our community. We believe in the work we're doing, and I think it's important to be able to create spaces like that in our day-to-day kind of new normal and life in quarantine, right? How can we find places to connect to those things that really speak to us, to our hearts and to our minds in a way that feels purposeful?
Yeah, and I think, again, Alex, that idea of sort of our organizations, and again, especially for volunteers, being sort of touchstones in the community already for them. And so in the same way that it might be about some of, you know, sort of family or friends group, like that sort of connection is another group connection that they've lost. And sort of how do we keep it going and hope that we can all be together in some way. So I don't know, does anybody else have any thoughts about sort of either what they're doing or trying to do, or questions for the group as far as how we sort of keep together when we can't be together? Feel free to unmute yourself or ask a question in the chat, whatever works for folks. If not, we'll keep talking.
I guess I would, I'll get to Amanda's question in a second. The other thing I wanted to point out is you know, we're talking about like how we can stay engaged with an organization or an entity that we're already involved in. I should also point out that there's a wonderful personal element to this as well. I started keeping a journal, you know, just for myself about, you know, which is both kind of cathartic and also as a historian kind of important to document for me what's happening. The Vermont Folklife Center is doing this great project, Listening in Place, and they're providing resources for like family members to interview each other. We're going to start a podcast soon where we connect with folks to sort of get their stories. So, you know, we're talking a lot about how we can sort of volunteer and be engaged with the organization, but it's also important to note the flip side around, you know, how we can do things that are also for ourselves and our own sort of personal memory and and sense of community, within our own household and not just with an organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Amanda, your question sort of leads into the next topic I think we're going to talk about. Is that right, Eileen, about, what's challenging about not being physically present?
Right. Yeah. So I think, we sort of wanted to sort of talk about what are the challenging, or what's the most challenging aspect of working with the volunteers while they can't be physically there.
So obviously technology in terms of access, technology in terms of a barrier. Do you have folks that are living in a place where high-speed internet is not widely available? Or, we had a situation with a volunteer who had, all the components to do a Zoom chat, but their microphone and webcam just happened to be a bit too old. So they had to call in instead. I do encourage folks to, and I'm certainly happy to have more discussions about this offline, to explore alternatives. As we know, Zoom obviously has some security and privacy concerns. We adopted it because I teach at CCV and they adopted it. So it was kind of, you work with what you know. There are some wonderful resources out there through other platforms. I know Google has a version of this. I found another one today that's entirely browser-based. So you can do video conferencing in a way that doesn't require downloading a program or those sorts of things. And so I just want to point out there that there are alternatives if you do find yourself in a space where folks are running into technology barriers. So that's definitely a piece of it. The other thing is just being mindful of volunteers who maybe weren't connected originally in terms of electronic communication. We certainly have folks who don't use email and who communicated through in-person conversations and phone conversations around their responsibilities. So are we making sure that we're reaching out to people who would not have communicated electronically anyways? I think another piece that was challenging was and I think sorry, just to respond to Erica's point, that part of this is just patience, right? The first Zoom meeting we had with folks, I was talking with some of my board members on the phone and kind of guiding them into the meeting, and they're like, oh wow, this is great, we have so many people in our Zoom meeting. And I said, well, yes, you are in a Zoom meeting, but you're not in our Zoom meeting. And they'd accidentally joined somebody else's discussion. So the first two times we did this, the first 20 minutes were just getting to a place where we were all connected. So just having patience and a willingness to try something new and a willingness to try again, recognizing that maybe your neighborhood's connection is overloaded, and there may be times you have to switch video off or only communicate using the chat function. I think just kind of recognizing from the get-go that it's not going to be perfect every time or not always work the way we want it to work. In terms of other challenges when we're not physically together, I think there are some things beyond that kind of technical piece about connecting. The loss of engagement around work that just requires you to be physically present. There are some things that just don't translate to a virtual environment. So recognizing that there are things we have to put on hold or pause or step away from. Navigating sort of just the larger shifting reality. I remember there was a bit of a response when we first closed the building down. This was March 12th. I sent out an email and said, we're shutting down. And a few folks were like, oh, great, it'll be empty so we can get a lot more work done. And, it took a while to get used to the fact that no, social distancing really means we're not going in. I sent my intern out the door with 3 boxes of random projects that I had found, hoping that they were going to be something worthwhile to work on. So, just being patient with the ever-changing landscape and how things are kind of shifting. And that was a challenge, and getting used to this and recognizing, we can't go in the building and we may not be in touch for months rather than weeks. And how do you navigate that? I just want to mention again, that sort of grief around loss of, we say loss of community in a lot of sense. And I think a lot of nonprofits are feeling this. It's a bit of a loss of family, right? I mean, these are nonprofits are families. These are people you work closely with. You know about their lives and what their families are doing. And if somebody's struggling, with a personal issue or a health issue, or we get into all these lively, political debates. It's hard. It feels like years ago, but the hot topic a month and a half ago was the divide in our community over whether to fund a new municipal swimming pool. And, we had to create rules about how we could talk about it. And when you're in the moment, maybe it's a little off-putting, but now you just miss it, right? Sitting around having coffee and those things before we got to to our work for the day. So I think it's really important to continue to find ways to maintain that connection, and to continue to find ways to have a positive attitude around, being together, and to be patient and not make it all about the work. How can we connect as people and human beings, and not just folks that are engaged in a shared work project is really important. And checking on each other and having a sense of humor, celebrating, as someone just pointed out, Sarah, the minor miracles of getting everyone together on technology. I mean, we're really proud. It was definitely applause worthy. And so I think anything that we can do to bring the museum, or gallery, or whatever your nonprofit organization is, to find a way to bring a piece of that home, and to be able to come together, virtually, over the phone, in whatever way we can that's accessible and engaging across the spectrum, I think is so key.
Yeah, and again, I do love Sarah's, getting all the ladies on Zoom. And it's sort of an interesting, is anybody else or anybody having any issues talking, not necessarily even with people who before weren't, I'm not on the internet, kind of pushback, but who don't have access? I think that's another big question mark, certainly sort of at a broader community level, but also with the volunteer engagement levels, is literally, do people have the internet at home that can handle, this sort of work? And I think, again, that sort of socializing community point is one to just keep thinking of over and over again. I did want to ask sort of, and this is for anyone and everyone, as far as sort of talking about planning for the future, how, or has anybody sort of started to engage with volunteers or board about not just the practicality of what some of the issues are coming out of this, but what maybe sort of some of the positives could be coming out of this? I know we've talked a little bit about the fact that people are more likely to use Zoom or happy about technology, thinking that means we can move some of our audience to different platforms, and maybe that is an overall positive. What has anybody else sort of thought of or sort of worked towards on sort of thinking about what are the positive changes we might be able to see coming out of what's a very negative situation?
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I would, I think there's a real positive for us in that I feel like I'm starting to understand more about the value of our mission and the value of history in our community. And I have never been busier. I've never had more people emailing me with all sorts of crazy questions and project ideas, and parents needing help and teachers wanting help. And it's really helping me in some ways to hone in on what, on what our core mission is and what a role in our community can be. And now the challenge is to help the community see that and value it, when we're going to need to go to our members and say, okay, every single member needs to step it up, and maybe even step it up one notch if we're going to make it financially. So figuring out how to articulate what I see as a really increased need is something I'm working through.
I would like to echo what Sarah said. I agree with that. I certainly haven't gotten any busier before all of this happened. I think that this is actually a really good opportunity for us to, just as museums, to get out there and be more in the community spotlight, because so many people are seeking things to do online, right? Like the Saint Albans Museum putting out there the history from home activities and things like that. I know a lot of museums are doing projects like that right now, and a lot of community members are looking for those things right now. They're looking for something to keep busy with, something to entertain the kids, something to keep their mind engaged. And so I'm hoping that there might have been a lot of community members that maybe weren't coming to our small local museums year after year because, oh, I thought 5 years ago, why go back? There are those people, unfortunately. And so I think that now they might see what we bring to the community, that it's more than just the physical space, that we really do play an integral role in collecting our heritage, collecting our history. And I hope that our community sees that, and that museums are able to come out of this even more present.
Yeah, and I like, Lisa, again, that sort of idea of recognizing us for what we already do in a lot of ways. And I think, Sarah, that's, part of what you're talking about is, and we've certainly talked about all the stuff that we already had online, or even, again, our Third Thursday Facebook Live talk, where we usually always do a Facebook Live talk with our in-person talk. And the Facebook Lives on those get 2 or 3 people that watch. This Facebook Live one got 40 plus people, live watching it. And, it was the same offering that we'd been offering before, but people were in a different headspace about what they were open to and were looking for. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to sort of see, where does the shift become sort of more permanent versus short term? And do we see people who are more willing and know about engaging with you, on not just coming to visit the museum? Or do we see people in the long term who are like, no, now I really want to go visit the museum because I couldn't visit the museum? I think that'll be an interesting thing.
So I want to emphasize and echo, I think you all make great points. Having a bit of a sense of scalability around all of this. So, I mentioned in a normal operating year, we might have 40 volunteers, and certainly in Franklin Grand Isle counties, I know there are museums that are lucky if they have 4 volunteers, show up to a meeting or to do some work. And, of that group right now, there's only maybe 8 to a dozen people engaged. So, I recognize that maybe in a different position than some other smaller historical societies and museums. But I would just emphasize that I was in a chat with some museum professionals the other day, and one of them was a parent and said the best advice they had right now came from the Frozen 2, the Disney movie that just came out recently. And, there's a great song about, when you don't know what to do, just do the next right thing. And of course, that's a wonderful lesson for kids, but I think there's a lot for us to take away from that as well. So if there's a sense of, I can barely manage my collections or do a program when I'm at full capacity, how could I ever manage to do something when it's just me or just a handful of folks, or, people aren't in touch because they're engaged elsewhere, to just give yourself some space to do a small thing, to do the next right thing for your organization, and to not be afraid to connect with community partners. I think it's easy sometimes in the cultural heritage field to kind of separate ourselves from other nonprofits because, maybe we see our mission as a little more superfluous than, somebody who's, on the front lines of healthcare and homelessness and, serving direct human needs, health and human services needs in our community. And I guess I would just share that, there is space for our work and a need for our work in all levels and in all ways. So, can you find a way maybe to connect with your local library? Have you had a conversation with your local school? Our first podcast is going to be with the Saint Albans City Mayor and the Saint Albans Town Select Board Chair, kind of putting this in all of this in historical context. And so we reach out to our municipality. So, if you're feeling like, we're just too small, or we just don't have the support base, or, we can't, we have barriers around technology, I would encourage you to see, are there community partners you can engage with? Are there other ways that you can be part of the conversation that's happening in your community, and find ways to, we talk so much these days about how we're better together and how the way forward and through all this is together. And I think that's important to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about ourselves as nonprofit organizations as well, that we're not alone in trying to do what we want to do during this time.
Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Oh, here's a good one. Let's see what that says. Oh, Erica. Yep. Yeah, and sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Oh, you go.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think that's a great point about, again, that anything we do, doing it again or being able to have access to it at an off time is important. I'll take Amanda's sort sort of probably words out of her mouth, the online trivia that we're doing every Wednesday night, you know, it's a Wednesday night at 7, like that might be bedtime for parents. But then we're offering it the next week as sort of a standalone so that people could do it on their own. So you have the ability to have that community feeling of everybody sort of at the same point in time on something like that, but also then offering the as something that people can do when it's good for them. So I think that's definitely one of those really important points, Erica, about the fact that we have to have kind of both in some ways.
It's also an important time, I think, to think about accessibility. And it's something we all sort of strive to be better at in the cultural heritage world, but, you know, are you making sure that you're exploring opportunities to do things like closed captioning? Are you exploring opportunities for making sure that your social media posts, for example, are accessible to screen reader programs and things like that? So for folks that are living with those challenges in their day-to-day life, you know, how are we making sure that we're doing our best to make our content accessible for all? And I think, you know, Erica's point is also well taken, and that there just has to be, you know, I think I'm more in love with the 80-20 rule than I ever have been before. There just has to be sort of the sense of good enough, and in terms of getting things out there and recognizing, you know, certainly with our board, there are folks that we just haven't really heard from. Of course, we check on them and just to see how they're doing, but, you know, there are some people who just aren't in a place to wear their museum hats right now, and it's okay. It's okay to not be okay, and that may shift from day to day. So how can we just find ways to, you know, continue to encourage accessibility and to make things, you know, as Erica said, asynchronous, so that they're available later and that people have multiple opportunities or channels or platforms as best we can to access things. And again, you could spend your whole day just doing that. So how can we find that balance of making content available?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do like the point again of that sort of it just has to exist, and I think again people are sort of more open to, it doesn't have to be fully polished, or it can look a little whatever, or we can all be in our weird Zoom background things, and it's you know it's totally fine. The importance is sort of the connection and the content over the flash, and I think that's you know becoming more and more sort of obvious for folks and what they're looking for these days.
I think some advice that I heard, or some language that I heard that was really hard for me at first, was when people sort of were talking about this as an opportunity. And I definitely shied away from that these first few weeks. Like, this is not an opportunity. This is a public health crisis. Like, I don't want to hear about silver linings. I'm just trying to manage how I feel about all this and my students and my work and family and my dog and those sorts of things. And I think with a bit of time and space, I'm starting to be more open to that message, that this kind of is an opportunity to recalibrate, to reorient, to think about your message. You know, the old adage of strategic planning, you know, where do you want to be 10 years from now? You know, who's your audience? Those types of questions. You know, if you can't answer those now, then, you know, this public health crisis and pandemic is not the issue. Your organization may have been facing some of this before. So in some ways, this has forced us to take a look at, you know, who is our audience. Certainly, our visitor demographics tend to trend older, and one of the things we've always talked about is how can we reach younger families. So we made a conscious effort to Erica's point, to do activities that were designed for what we're calling our junior curators, which are kids of any age really, but we developed 2 offline activities. One was a coloring book where we used, Lisa used Photoshop to transform images from our collections into coloring sheets, and the other was we made a kind of a DIY museum activity where, you know, kids or anyone really could put together objects in their household and kind of make their own museum and come up with labels and sign and a theme and take pictures of it. And, you know, again, not involving screen time. And so for us, it was simple to do, but it sort of reinforced that larger message that, you know, as an organization before all of this, we were trying to be more conscious about how could we reach young families and, you know, younger visitors. So, you know, there will be a time when we move past this current situation. How can we take the lessons we learned from, you know, creating these online activities and apply it to our regular educational programming and those sorts of things. A scavenger hunt, Sarah, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
that's
great.
Definitely a good idea to promote.
Yeah, and I like that again, it's sort of the multi-option ways in which to interact. And I think this does sort of push back too to sort of how do we keep engaged with the board and volunteers too, is sort of that multi-option, and obviously that takes a little work, but knowing that some might be more interested in helping with something that's they can do online. Some might be more interested in just sort of doing something, talking on the phone or writing stuff down, or so that again, that I think that those multi sort of ways of engagement is still something that's going to pull through based on both what people have the time for and what they can do. I am wondering, we talk about audience for young families. Do you or anybody else have any indication related to, do you think we're going to be able to create things that allow more young families and younger folks to be volunteers as well? Is this some of this stuff that's not time related or space related, translatable long term for attracting volunteers?
I think the short answer is yes. Certainly there's no reason that if you're engaged in virtual volunteering now, and we sort of are back in a place where we're resuming our normal kind of work and life schedules, making time for volunteering, as we all know from the great sociological study Bowling Alone, like Americans just don't have time, the way we did decades ago, to kind of commit to these sorts of things. So absolutely, I think there's no reason that, just because we're kind of back to our normal routines, that we can't continue to provide opportunities for folks to stay engaged with our work that don't require being in the building. I also think there's a really strong movement to the museum world in general to be open to citizen curation. So the more that we can put, there was a time when sort of the talking heads were saying, don't put your collections online because people won't come to the museum. Don't do video tours because you're giving it away, and I just think that's so outdated. I think what that does is it engages people, and there are some people who maybe just can't visit your museum because of distance or other barriers or challenges. So you want to make it accessible for them. But I think we sort of now know that the idea is that it engages people, it inspires people, it makes them kind of eager to engage content more. And I think anything we can do to reflect history and art or libraries, literacy as disciplines that we can bring more of into our lives, that's great too. I'm thinking of Sarah's downtown scavenger hunts. I just saw a great resource that I think we're going to find a way to adapt, that was about, making a time capsule, sort of my coronavirus time capsule. And it was a series of kind of interview questions, obviously designed for kids to talk to their parents or their siblings about, or family members on the phone.
I've had that request from teachers to do a time capsule. Mm-hmm. And we have one diary that the 4th grade reads that's from 1911, and it dawned on me that the child they read about would have lived through the Spanish influenza. So I created a little time capsule of artifacts that she might have collected, with some prompts for the kids. And so the kids are now creating their own time capsules, and one's around like food, being a helper, stuff like that. So it's definitely something teachers are thinking about, the time capsules. I wondered about the citizen curation that you were just talking about, because I've been starting to try to put together a community-based sort of archive to document COVID-19, and wondering if anyone else is starting to work on that. I mean, I've started to set it up, but I'm wondering if anyone has begun in any particular way.
Yeah, so I'll just share a little bit, and I will actually we have our virtual roundtable on Thursday with Erica talking about collecting COVID-19. And so, we're definitely at VHS starting to sort of figure out what the framework is for a wider sort of collection aspect related to that. And I think it's, and I've seen it from a lot of different sort of historical societies around the country, that they're starting with different sort of programs and types of collections. A lot of it, obviously, Alex had mentioned the Folklife Center and their listing in place. I think, again, for us, it's sort of figuring out what is the more sort of quote unquote traditional kinds of things like, you know, sort of encouraging photo taking and journaling related to that, and that sort of traditional collection kind of feel. Anyone else so far?
We had just started engaging folks actually around our Rail City, our Central Vermont Railway exhibition project, and it was just a Google form to kind of collect some community sponsors and stories. We were looking at like a file transfer program to collect images. We just shifted to Past Perfect Online, so there may be some opportunities there as an organization. We even talked about getting like a Google Voice number and doing like a SAM hotline where people could kind of call in and you know, just share their stories and memories. So I think, you know, Sarah, you're absolutely right that any way we can find ways to you know, engage folks, not just with historical content, but sort of also in the moment, recognizing that 25, 50 years from now and beyond, folks are going to be reading our journals, you know, and diaries and blogs, and looking at recordings of discussions and listening to oral history, and wondering, you know, how did we manage all of this?
Yeah, I set up a Google Drive with a whole set of folders with different topics. And then my volunteers have each agreed to sort of keep their eyes out based on those topics. The school, food, the general store. And so they're cutting, pasting out of the listserv and various blogs and dumping it into Google Drive. So at least we have it all in one place. And then I'm looking at creating a Google form community diary entry kind of thing, but that's the one I'm still wondering about. So that's kind of where it is right now. It's really basic, but I'm hoping there's such a tremendous amount of content being generated in our town right now on the listserv in particular that we're going to lose it if we don't start grabbing it now and sticking it at least in Google folders. So that's how I started with it. I don't know if that's the right way, but that's what I'm doing.
Again, the 80-20, you know, capturing something and, you know, having a simple methodology. You know, you could spend a week trying to figure out the perfect program. Sometimes it's just about actually doing the work instead of waiting for the ideal solution. I think Erica makes a great point. How can you think about local audiences that might be supportive of this? So are there, you know, do you have an opportunity to work with students? Can you offer sort of a virtual internship where you can assign specific tasks to students? I'm thinking of other homeschool groups that may be looking for projects. You know, does your local social studies teacher, you know, need something to enrich what they're doing in their classroom? You know, have you thought about reaching out to like the Scouts or, you know, other community organizations, or, you know, your senior center, or, you know, do you have a relationship with your local newspaper? Could you put a call out for information and support in your local media, and things like that? I think are important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I do love, again, the idea of sort of tasking your volunteers, again, Sarah, that this is another thing that they can really feel as part of the organization, that institutionally they're helping you right now by being on the lookout, by helping to gather those things and being given very specific tasks and ownership, which I think is part of the volunteering experience in the first place, and why a lot of people do like that sort of engagement and community feeling, is they have a certain part of ownership of sort of what the organization is doing, and they feel very tied to that. And that's another great way of tying folks to that continued ownership, even when they're not around.
And reinforcing that everyone has a role to play. You know, I've had a couple volunteers say, well, I don't, whether it's technology or time or just, you know, there's nothing for me to do right now, or I don't feel comfortable with that, or even just, I don't know that I have anything to add. And just, you know, it's almost heartbreaking to hear, you know, as a volunteer coordinator, because you know, there's so much folks can be doing in so many ways, large and small. So any way that you as a volunteer coordinator or director or, you know, board chair can reinforce we're a part, we can still, you know, be engaged in the work, and that we still care and value, you know, what we each have to say and bring to the group. You know, that's obviously tremendously important when we're in sort of regular operating mode. I think that's even more important now.
Yeah. Cool.
I touch on governance quickly.
Oh yes, board specific stuff. Awesome.
So yeah, we talked a lot about kind of program centric volunteering, thinking about governance in your board. You know, again, how can you approach this in a way that makes sense for your organization? the very first thing we did was pass a continuity plan. So I drafted a document that basically outlined and enhanced the executive committee, recognizing that maybe the full board wasn't going to be able to meet, or that we were going to have to make decisions, you know, and be a bit more agile and adaptable than even normal operating times. So we created this enhanced executive committee that was comprised of the officers, a non-officer board member, and a volunteer, and also brought a community member in to engage a bit with it, so that we kind of represented all the various constituencies that are involved in decision making. And we had, then this group committed to meeting weekly, so that board members who wanted to stick to the monthly meetings or just were not in a place where they, you know, felt that they could engage or advocate at this time, it was important to kind of have that in place and a mechanism so that we could respond to things like, you know, the EIDL and the PPP and things like that. And in a lot of ways that actually kind of clarified some roles and responsibilities. I think all organizations struggle a bit sometimes with that. So, you know, in a way, all our priorities are in focus a bit more clearly now than maybe they would be otherwise. We're a bit more efficient. You know, this group that meets weekly then communicates with the full board, which still meets. Everybody gets copies of the minutes, you know, and we did have a board member say, hey, look, I'm, you know, not comfortable with technology, or another person say, like, you know, even calling it on the phone is hard, you know, and those sorts of things. So, you know, any way that you can make sure that, you know, if you are making decisions and you are making progress in these areas that you're finding, you know, before I always communicated with volunteers through a weekly email. So I've kept that up so that, you know, we do a monthly e-newsletter, and minutes still go out to the full committee, even members, you know, that haven't participated since this all started, so that we can continue to kind of maintain that sense of community. And of course, it does reignite a bit our sense of passion, you know, a greater sense of appreciation for each other and gratitude. And, you know, obviously that was always there, but it's so much more, it's sort of in the picture of the moment. And the other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind, and why I'm glad that we spent a lot of time talking about like forward-facing kind of educational and programming content, is that it has to be about more than money. And that was a point that I really pushed back with my executive committee. Of course, we have to talk about how we're going to pay the bills. Of course, we have to talk about, you know, is this going to impact staffing? Is this going to impact opening day? We had to delay our biggest fundraiser of the year to the fall, which of course creates an immediate cash flow problem. So, you know, we have to think about what our funder is going to be doing or not doing. But in all of that, you have to find a way to still make it about your mission, because if you're not connected to the work, if you're not really spending some time at the core of what you do and why you do it, and sort of the reason we're all here and the reason the community looks to us, I think you really put yourselves at risk organizationally and personally. Of course, that's important to make space for self-care and to not feel like you have to be, you know, that was the struggle for me personally. You know, I was sort of looking at self-care as an achievement, and I felt like the whole organization was on my shoulders. And, you know, that as the staff member, that I'm responsible for the survival of SAM. And I had to kind of really reckon with that myself, and be willing to reach out to volunteers and to take on more ownership and leadership in certain areas, and to delegate in other areas, and to really clarify what's important right now. And so finding ways that you can make sure that the community, whether it's through your own communications, through your local media, through the educational content you offer, again, don't do the next right thing and start small, but any way you can continue to sort of demonstrate value and commitment and presence in a way that is mission driven and focused around service to the community has to be a part of the conversation. It just can't be about finances, because really then what's the point? And I know you need both, and I know that both are important, and that you have to prioritize you know, keeping the doors open at some point or reopening at some point. But it just needs to be sure that, we just need to be sure that, you know, mission is part of our decision-making mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and again, this is sort of the when we take away talking about efficiency and what you're all discussing now, taking away sort of the chaff and really getting back down to what's the core, and then everybody can sort of focus around that. And I think it's an interesting thing to sort of bring boards especially back to, of okay, now we can really have to focus on mission and what it really means and what value is and how we sort of bring that out. And I think that that's really, hopefully, again, something that we can move forward from this as well. I think also from a governance standpoint, it's just for folks to be aware that I think this is the time everybody's realizing that maybe they need to take a look at their bylaws again and see what does it allow you to do in situations that pop up like this. And do you need to make long-term changes? There's obviously some change going on at the state level related to open meeting laws and what do those mean for what you can or can't do. So I think that's just another thing to sort of be aware of, and sort of think about, again, what does that mean for how you're sort of future meeting or future making decisions as a board or with your governance. So that'll. And
maybe it's an opportunity just to look at your bylaws. Sorry, I didn't mean to step over there, but that's obviously right to make sure that you're in compliance, or where do you have flexibility, and but some of that deep background work, right? If you haven't updated your volunteer handbook, your staff handbook, your board handbook for a few years, if you haven't updated your collections policy, we have an event space in our museum, and obviously we're not, we do weddings and things like that, and obviously we're not doing any rentals right now, and not projecting to for potentially a couple more months. But it doesn't mean that we can't develop all those marketing materials in advance, to be ready to go when we kind of get back to a place when we are sort of gathering. And I mentioned in an interview the other day this idea of museums without walls, and I just wanted to kind of share that sort of phrase again, that you can exist outside of the physical space. And at some point, museums, just like libraries, schools, community centers, and town halls, are going to be a gathering space again. And I think we're going to have a role in helping to heal our community. So I'm sorry, I mean, that I jumped in on you, but it just really made me think of when you started to talk about that, like there may be some deep background work that has just always been on the back burner, because you're putting out fires and you're responding to day-to-day operations and guest services, but there may be opportunities to kind of look at some of that structural stuff, and maybe you have some volunteers that are willing to kind of take on some of those lifts because they can give it some careful attention. So that's another thing to keep in mind too, is there's a sort of organizational background material. When was the last time you updated your brochure? When was the last time you updated your website and your social media? Maybe now there's an opportunity to really spend some time with that content.
Yeah, great. All right. Any other thoughts, comments, random things folks want to share?
We have our first board meeting today via Zoom. We've had our executive committee meeting, as an interim, making some pretty big decisions that we're bringing over to the board now. But one of the things, Alex, that you said that really strikes me is one of the board members immediately said, we're going to lose our membership. There's no way they're going to give their dollars to us. And so helping the board remember that we have a valuable mission and understand the role of members, and that members are the core of who we are, and helping them to articulate that. That's probably my biggest goal for our board meeting today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I did it again.
No, I think again, that Sarah, that point, again, as we talk about mission and value, and that I know it's certainly something we're struggling with, from development standpoint of what should the message be, how can we put ourselves out there while people don't have food in a very, immediate way, or they're struggling because they can't work, and how do we sort of balance that obvious sort of feel that we quote unquote aren't at the same level or aren't worth it, with the continuing need to value ourselves and to know that we provide value, and then to keep engagement on the folks and with the folks that do support us and will continue to support us.
I want to interrupt. I was reading an article that AASLH put out the other day about building a sort of the empathetic audience and being empathetic to your audience, and that there are so many more needs beyond sort of medical needs and hunger needs now that are emotional and social, and that is those mental health needs are ones that museums can certainly be supporting, and so figuring out how to articulate that is important.
Yeah.
I think just to follow up on that, Sarah, one of the things that I found most helpful to think about is that people look to stories to help make sense of things that don't otherwise make sense of. And museums and historical societies in particular are very, very good at both sharing stories and helping people to put those stories together for themselves, providing those tools, whether it's something as sort of basic as critical thinking, as something as more complicated as like emotional responses to past events and things like that. The stories that we construct and share help people to process. So that's been useful for me.
Mm. Yeah.
You know, Sarah, it just you made me think of, you know, how could you message to your board, you know, this idea that membership and community support is about more than dollars, right? So obviously you can't ignore the impact that maybe a reduced membership drive would have on your budget for the year, but how can you have a conversation that membership is about, you know, helping your community and those folks who are engaged with your work to feel like they're a part of the organization, to feel like their stories, the fact that they're going to eventually come back and visit, attend your programming, and those sorts of things, that has just as much value in the long term as a financial donation. And, you know, making sure that there's opportunities for, you know, I talked a little bit about struggling with reorientation and kind of realignment, and, you know, what can we take away from all this? And there may be a part of that, recognizing that, you know, there's something in our mission and the way we understand our audience that's going to fundamentally shift with this experience. And rather than, you have to be practical about the finances, I'm not saying that, but rather than maybe sort of only focusing or lamenting that loss, how can we also look at it as an opportunity to think about the story we're telling and how we're communicating our work, and the importance of community memory and common heritage and a sense of place and a sense of home, and all those things, you know, that Amanda was referring to, and Eileen as well, about how we can, you know, just continue to think about engagement and presence outside of a transactional relationship, I think is really important at this time. You know, I think you see maybe, I don't know, St. Albans, it seems to be a big area of emphasis. I'm not sure what's happening in other communities, but there's been a lot of rallying around the downtown restaurants, you know, for carry out and stuff like that. And the movie theater did like drive-through popcorn, I think, one night for families and things like that. And so at some point there will be a similar response, you know, to other community organizations as well.
Yeah, and I see sort of Erica's point and question about social service organization partnerships. And I think that is sort of a big sort of opportunity and a sort of a way of engagement. I don't know if anybody's done anything already with social service organizations or has thought about anyone that they're working with, both as a sort of an audience question mark, and I think also sort of that inclusion question as well could be interesting.
There may be a sense of maybe right now is not exactly the time perhaps to engage in that question, and I think it's all variable depending on, you know, your local, you know, what's happening in your community. But I think that's Erica, you raise an important question, and I mean, you articulate it well. I think at some point these things we talked about in terms of like community memory and documentation, it may be worth creating space to allow the first responders and social service organizations in your community specifically to have a place where they feel like they can engage what's happening with them, or to document what's going on in their lives. You know, yeah, I think we're probably all a little sensitive to timing around that, you know, knowing how valuable it is right now for folks, but should potentially also be, you know, an area of emphasis kind of going forward, is how can we sort of gently create a separate space for those folks that are on the front lines of this pandemic, and, you know, what are they going through and what are they experiencing, and how are they managing it, and what are they seeing and hearing, and how can we find a way that's sort of maybe ethically and morally sensitive to create space to ask those questions. And I would just echo Erica's other comment too, like there anything you can do to create a shared sense of community and space, and to explore partnerships. We have a large room that can hold 175 people. So one of the things we did was share with our, local government, if you need a space, we can potentially provide, a space for staging, logistics, storage, whatever those needs may be. So there may be some sort of very tangible connections that we can make with local health and human services groups. And there may be just some place for listening and conversation and documentation, and providing support. I think the other big sense of community you're maybe seeing, and again, this is here in St. Albans, there are sort of appreciation parades, and folks letting our healthcare workers know that they're valued, teachers driving around and making signs and waving to students. Is that something your museum can be a part of, folks putting bears in their windows and those sorts of things? So if there are community activities that are already about, engaging and providing opportunity to connect while being socially distant, that you have, a role to play in that as well.
Yeah, and I think again, in this question mark of short-term and long-term is, maybe there is some long-term, again, any long-term social service impacts, and maybe that's where we're looking both at what are the ways in which we can bring sort of our value, the enrichment, the sort of things that we have to groups working with underprivileged people who may in fact increase after this. And so how can we think about making sure we're inclusive and accessible in those ways in the long term? And that might be more sort of direct partnership related. And I think that's sort of a really intriguing idea to think about.
Marginalization has always been a challenge and a problem in our field. So definitely that's, like you said, more kind of in view today, even so than before. So how continuing to find ways to be accessible and open is super important.
Great. Other questions, comments, things people just want to talk about? We're here, we're Zooming. Awesome. All right. Well, I think if folks sort of feel we've talked well today, I will definitely encourage everyone to come again on Thursday. We'll be with Erica and Paul Carnahan from the Historical Society, and we'll be talking about collecting COVID-19 and what we're planning, and sort of all talking through what might be good about that. And then again, Tuesdays going forward, we've got a couple other great topics, both related to what's happening now, and then just some stuff that's just more like, hey, let's talk about some of the things we do day to day. And so again, thank you guys all for coming with us. I think it's been great to see some of you, and certainly to hear from all of you, and to hopefully keep our own sense of community strong, because I think that's the important thing. We have to keep self-care within our museum sphere for all of us. So thanks again. Have a great rest of the day, everybody, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you.